The Stratford Shakespeare Festival was founded to showcase the finest dramatic works in history, with its central focus, of course, on the plays of William Shakespeare. People have long celebrated Shakespeare's ability to use words to delve into the hearts and souls of his characters, while at the same time telling some of the most compelling stories ever to be acted upon a stage. But there are other works, such as novels or poems, that move us with their stories, stories that, unlike Shakespeare's plays, were never intended to be brought to life on stage. And yet those tales have had such a profound impact on people who have read them or heard them, that playwrights, directors, and actors have been inspired to adapt them to the living, breathing art of theatrical performance.
I was in high school, and although The Grapes of Wrath was a very revered and popular novel, even in the early 50s when I was growing up, it wasn't required reading at school, but my parents had a copy of it in our home. So I read it. It was an adventure. It was a little bit bold because the novel was very adult. So it was an overpowering experience. And coming to the end of it, well, it's indescribable how the tragic pietà that concludes the novel cuts so deep into the soul. I was a kid, but I never forgot it. I was invited to join the Steppenwolf Ensemble in Chicago. And I met with Gary Sinise, who was the artistic director at the time. I was in his little office upstairs in the theater, and he said, you know, now you've become a member of the ensemble, you should be thinking about, you know, something that you would really like to do that would be good for the company. I said, well, what about The Grapes of Wrath? And he thought, oh my God, that would be a great idea.
One of the members of the company at the time, Walter Borden, was an enormous fan of Derek Walcott's, and he spoke with Richard Manette, who was the artistic director at the time, about this adaptation that Derek had done of the Odyssey by Homer. And Derek Walcott originally wrote a series of poems and was inspired by the Odyssey because the Odyssey is a story about trying to find your way home, which was very resonant for Walcott, being a Trinidadian and contending with the whole diaspora of African peoples around the world. And what is home? Where are we from? What are the battles and struggles that we face? And the Odyssey became a very resonant metaphor, I think, for Derek and experience. And so he wrote these poems, and then in the 90s he was commissioned by the Royal Shakespeare Company to adapt the Odyssey as a play. And Walter Borden had come across this play, had given it to Richard, and it's very outrageous adaptation. And Richard came to me and said, would I be interested in doing it, which I really was.
I'd had a lot of experience adapting fiction for the stage. It was something that I pursued as a graduate student. I had wonderful teachers at Northwestern University. So I was sort of familiar with the challenge of trying to find the play that's hiding inside of the novel. Even though it's an epic and it covers 30 chapters, only 15 of those 30 chapters are about the Joads. The other 15, the alternating chapters, are sort of landscapes, panoramic views. They're multivalent, there are lots of narrative voices. Sometimes it's biblical, sometimes it's very colloquial. So I knew that I could dispense with most of the wide-angle shots and focus on those 15 chapters that tell the story of the Joads. But then there was another thing about the aesthetic of the novel, this particular novel, that made adapting it less of a challenge. The narrator of The Grapes of Wrath that is, the voice that tells the story of the Joads, never penetrates the interior of any of the characters. You never learn from the narrator what Tom Joad is thinking, or what Ma is thinking, or what Pa is thinking. What you are given by the narrator, basically, are stage directions. They sit at the table, Tom stands, and he speaks. Well, that's already, in a way, a kind of built-in drama. So it became a really, really exciting process. And the more I worked on it, the more I worked my way through it, the more I realized that if I could be really attentive and responsible to the text, I might be able to get the whole thing on stage in a couple of hours.
I'd had the Debussy music in my mind for a long time and wasn't really sure what to do with it, and then I sort of fell into the idea of doing Moby Dick. It was a bit of a joke, really, because with all these projects, I didn't really know what I was talking about when I started, and I didn't really know what I was in for. But I think that in some ways I've always believed that the best road to creativity is throwing yourself into the deep end. And you know, you either succeed or you don't succeed. So I suggested that we put together the Moby Dick story, wordless movement piece, with the Debussy music. I was initially confronted by the enormous volume of words, and not just words, but imagery, and how are we going to do this, and how are we going to condense this piece, and what elements are we going to take out of it, and, you know, given the time we have to do it. And but I love that challenge. I mean, it's like just crazy. It's a crazy thing to try and do. It's like the most wordy novel, you know. Well, it's weird to say the most wordy novel because every novel is pretty much wordy. But let's just say it's one of the longest novels in English history. And so it's ridiculous to reduce it to nothing, which was part of the excitement of it. And part of the charge, part of the thrill was how can we do this? And the way those shows work, you do almost all your development in rehearsal. There's no real pre-development because you can't really plan movement. You can think about it. You can think about what it might be. You can construct the architecture of the story. You can put the music together with the architecture of the story as much as possible, but when it really comes down to it, you have to have the actors in the room and the music and put them together. But Stratford decided, I think wisely, to give us a week on our own in Toronto. We hired a bunch of people, and we got into a room at the opera offices, and we got a bunch of materials, and we just played around with images and shapes and tried to put together. I think we put together about 9 minutes of the piece, just experimenting with different things, and it was all a bit of a mess, but it was just so we could feel what it might be like, just to get a head start. We did create, for instance, in that workshop, we found a way for if everybody took their shirts and lifted them up over their heads, that created this wonderful sail thing, and that we created in the workshop. We found that in the workshop, and it gave us the confidence and the excitement to move forward into the project.
With an adaptation ready to be produced on stage, it may seem as if the most difficult part of the process is over. However, there is more to consider. What will the show look like, for instance? When an audience enters a theatre to see a new play based on a classic work of literature, how does this new production send out the message that it is exactly that, something new, while at the same time delivering the story that people know and love? And if that story is epic in scope, as is the Odyssey, how do you perform it with a limited number of people in the cast? And how do you make it accessible to a modern audience? Those are some of the questions that Peter Hinton had to address in his 2007 production of the Odyssey at the Studio Theatre.
The central image we chose was a modern one, which was a wrecked car. When you came in, there was an old car with the wheels taken off. And to me, that was such a powerful symbol of travel, but it's derelict. You know, one of the big contentious things we did is at the end of the play, a big sail unfurls and they're all taking off, and we chose a Canadian flag. We had a big Canadian flag as the sail of Odysseus' ship. And it was a bit, you know, on the money, but I loved it. I loved the politic of it. I loved the sort of, it had a kind of vitality to it. There's a crazy sequence in it in which Odysseus and his son and his old swineherd friend have to slay 99 suitors. And we had a cast of 20 or something. We did this, they played every suitor, and Athena has the list of all the men that were killed. And so we rehearsed that forever, this sequence of this choreographed archery. And all the guys in the camp, they'd just come up, they'd try to fight, they'd get shot, they'd fall down, they'd get up again and be the next guy. So it had this tremendous energy. And what I love working on an adaptation like that is you might not come up with that idea just straight from an idea to a play. Because the novel, you can do it. The book, the epic poem, you can. And so it put this challenge. Every day was like, oh my God, how are we going to do this scene? And that's a great thing. And you know, you see that in the Grapes of Wrath too. Like, there's something wonderful about seeing on stage something that was never envisioned to be on stage.
We would read the chapters before we would begin the rehearsals. We would keep going back to them to find the characteristics of what made the novel work and how they could be better realized on stage. From very careful analysis of the script and the novel. So each one of the situations, each one of the scenes required that kind of careful study and reimagination, really, to understand what it would be like for us in that situation.
It's a very, very powerful experience to see an ensemble as deep and passionate and skilled in artistry as the ensemble here at the Stratford Festival, embodying a story like The Grapes of Wrath. I've seen a number of productions of it since the production that I directed. And it's only been here that I have felt that the story has not only come alive in the way that I felt it when I worked on it, but it's also enriched beyond my experience of it, my original experience of it. And when you have artists of the stature and maturity and skill of the acting ensemble here at Stratford, led by a director like Antoni Cimolino, I mean, you have something, I mean, the story reaches a kind of level of expressiveness that's truly profound and very, very moving and inspiring to me.
When literature is adapted for the stage, it can take many forms. One thing, however, remains constant: the desire to tell a story that will resonate with people regardless of background or culture. Like the plays of William Shakespeare, those stories touch on emotions and experiences that we can all relate to, and that we can all find pleasure and catharsis in being able to claim, at least in part, as our own. The sense of connectedness that they create is part of the reason that they end up on our stages here in Stratford, and why memories of those productions will continue to echo in our theatres long after the proverbial curtain has fallen.